It was a brisk morning in the heart of the city, and the streets were buzzing with the usual hum of activity. Cars honked, pedestrians rushed by, and officers from the local precinct were stationed at various checkpoints, ensuring the day remained peaceful. Among the officers was a young duo, rookies, eager to prove themselves, their eyes sharp for any signs of trouble. Little did they know, today was about to take a turn no amount of training could have prepared them for. The sound of tires screeching caught their attention as a sleek black car cruised down the avenue. Its tinted windows and shiny rims seemed to reflect a sense of power and mystery. The officers exchanged a quick glance and nodded. They had found their next stop. After all, this part of town wasn't known for expensive vehicles, and the sight of one was enough to raise suspicion. One officer motioned for the car to pull over while the other adjusted his uniform, already imagining the praise they might receive for a routine yet effective stop. The car rolled to a slow halt, and the officers approached cautiously, one on each side. Through the tinted glass, they could barely make out the silhouette of a driver. "License and registration, please," one officer said firmly, his hand resting on his hip. There was a moment of stillness, and then the window lowered just enough for a woman's hand to pass the documents through. The officer's initial confidence wavered as they exchanged an uneasy glance. There was something about the calm, almost unbothered demeanor of the driver that felt off. The woman's voice, smooth and assertive, interrupted their thoughts. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped, officers?" she asked. Her tone wasn't angry, just precise, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. Ignoring the question, one of the officers scanned the documents, noting the name and address. The name felt familiar, but he couldn't place it. The other officer tried to maintain his authority. "We're conducting routine checks, ma'am. Just making sure everything is in order." The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. The tension in the air thickened as the officer with the documents glanced at her license again, his eyes widening slightly. That name, where had he seen it before? He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was missing something critical. Before they could continue their questioning, the woman spoke again, this time with an edge of steel in her voice. "Officers, I suggest you double-check those documents and take a closer look at who you're dealing with. Because if you don't, this stop is going to be a lot more memorable than you anticipated." Her words sent a chill down their spines. Who was this woman? And why did her calm confidence feel more commanding than any authority they thought they held? The officer with the documents stepped back, his mind racing. His partner frowned, leaning in to look at the license himself. That's when it hit them both like a lightning bolt. The woman in the driver's seat wasn't just anyone. She was their boss, Chief Angela Reed, the newly appointed head of their precinct. The realization hit them like a thunderclap, and for a brief moment, neither officer moved. The weight of their mistake was sinking in quickly, but there was no time to dwell on it. Chief Angela Reed watched them from behind the wheel, her expression steady, but her eyes sharp. The rookies were now scrambling internally, their minds racing to figure out their next move. Should they apologize? Pretend they hadn't recognized her? Or, worst of all, would she call them out on their behavior right then and there? Chief Reed didn't say a word as she glanced between the two, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them squirm. Finally, the officer holding her license cleared his throat awkwardly. Everything seems to check out, ma'am," he said, handing back her documents with a nervous smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're free to go." But Angela didn't move to take the license. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and asked, "And what was the reason for this stop again?" "Routine checks, was it?" The officer hesitated, his confidence from earlier completely gone. "Yes, ma'am, just routine." Angela leaned forward, her fingers lightly drumming on the steering wheel. "Routine, huh?" she said, her voice low but deliberate. "Funny, because as far as I know, there's no departmental directive for random stops on vehicles that just happen to stand out. Or am I mistaken?" The second officer, who had been silent until now, stepped in, trying to smooth things over. "Chief, we didn't realize it was you," he stammered. If we had known. Angela held up a hand, cutting him off. That's exactly the problem, she said sharply. You didn't know it was me, and yet you felt justified in pulling me over without a valid reason. Tell me, officers, how often does this happen? How often do you make routine stops like this? Neither of them could answer. The air felt heavy with tension, and they both knew that anything they said now would only dig them into a deeper hole. Angela sighed, her demeanor softening just a fraction. Listen, I'm not here to berate you, she said, her voice calmer now. But I need you to think about what just happened here and why you thought it was acceptable. Because this isn't just about me. It's about the people in this community who deal with this kind of treatment every day. The officers nodded, their heads hanging low. They were still too stunned to fully process what had just occurred. Angela leaned back in her seat and finally took her documents from the officer's trembling hand. We'll talk more about this back at the precinct, she said firmly. For now, let's just say I expect better from my team. With that, she rolled up her window and pulled back onto the road, leaving the two officers standing there, their faces a mix of shame and disbelief. As her car disappeared around the corner, the officers exchanged a look. They both knew this wasn't the end of the conversation, not by a long shot. Meanwhile, Angela drove on, her mind racing. She hadn't planned for her morning to go this way, but perhaps it was a necessary wake-up call, not just for the rookies but for the entire department. She'd taken the job as chief only 6 months ago, stepping into a position that many believed wasn't ready for someone like her. A black woman in charge of a precinct in a city grappling with deep-seated tensions between law enforcement and the community. It was a challenge she had willingly accepted, knowing full well the scrutiny she would face from both inside and outside the department. Her journey to this position hadn't been easy. Angela had worked her way up the ranks, starting as a patrol officer in a neighboring city. She'd faced her share of biases and roadblocks, but her determination and integrity had carried her through. Over the years, she'd earned the respect of her peers and superiors, proving time and again that she was more than capable of leading. When the position of chief opened up, she knew it was her time to step forward, even if it meant walking into a storm. But being the boss came with its own set of challenges. There were moments when she felt the weight of every decision, every policy change, every expectation placed on her shoulders. And then there were moments like this one, when the very people she was trying to lead made her question whether real change was possible. As she pulled into the precinct parking lot, Angela took a deep breath. She had a long day ahead, and she knew the conversation with those two officers was just the beginning. But if there was one thing she had learned in her years on the force, it was that change didn't happen overnight. It took time, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, even if it meant being the one to hold up the mirror. Inside the precinct, the mood was bustling as usual. Officers moved about, filing reports, taking calls, and preparing for their shifts. Angela's presence was immediately noticed as she walked in, her commanding presence cutting through the noise. A few officers greeted her with respectful nods, while others quickly turned their attention back to their work, not wanting to draw her gaze. Angela headed straight for her office, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. As she passed by the squad room, she caught sight of the two rookies from earlier, now seated at their desks, their faces pale and anxious. She didn't say a word, but gave them a pointed look that said everything. They would talk later, on her terms. Closing the door to her office, Angela allowed herself a moment to collect her thoughts. She glanced at the framed photos on her desk, her family, her academy graduation, and a snapshot of her first day as chief. Each image was a reminder of why she did what she did. This job wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about creating a better, more just system for everyone. But even as she reminded herself of her mission, a nagging thought lingered in the back of her mind. How many more officers in her department shared the same mindset as those rookies? And how could she reach them before another incident like this occurred? Angela shook her head, pushing the doubts aside. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to back down. Not today, not ever. If she had to fight to change the culture of her department, she would. One conversation, one policy, one difficult moment at a time. For now, though, she had work to do. And as she sat down at her desk, a new sense of determination settled over her. The road ahead might be long, but Angela Reed was no stranger to hard battles. This was just the beginning. Angela leaned back in her chair, staring at the stack of paperwork on her desk, but her mind wasn't on the forms or reports. It kept circling back to the morning's encounter. It wasn't the first time she'd seen this kind of behavior, but the fact that it had come from her own officers that stung in a way she couldn't quite shake. She tapped her pen against the desk, her jaw tightening. There was more at play here than just two overzealous rookies. This was a symptom of a larger issue, one she'd been fighting since the day she walked through the doors of this precinct. Outside her office, the buzz of activity continued. Officer Torres, one of the department's veterans, watched the rookies from across the room. He had seen their pale faces when Angela walked in, and it didn't take much to piece together what had happened. Torres had been around long enough to know how these routine stops usually played out. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Kids these days, he muttered under his breath. But the truth was, Torres wasn't entirely blameless himself. He'd grown up in the department when things were different, when certain behaviors were overlooked or brushed aside. Over the years, he'd learned to toe the line, but deep down, he knew the culture hadn't really changed. It had just become quieter, more subtle. And now, with a chief like Angela, who wasn't afraid to call things out, those quiet prejudices were being dragged into the light. Torres got up and made his way to the coffee station, where he found Officer Hayes, one of the rookies, nervously stirring sugar into his cup. "Tough morning?" Torres asked casually, though he already knew the answer. Hayes looked up, startled, then nodded. "Yeah, you could say that." He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting Angela to appear at any moment. "We didn't know it was her," he added quickly, as if that made it better. Torres took a sip of his coffee and gave Hayes a long look. "Does it matter?" he asked. His tone wasn't accusatory, but there was a weight to his words. "Would you have done anything different if it wasn't her?" Hayes opened his mouth to respond but stopped. He didn't know how to answer. He wanted to say yes, to defend himself, but the truth was staring him in the face. Torres sighed and patted him on the shoulder. "You've got a lot to learn, kid," he said before walking away. Meanwhile, Angela was meeting with her second-in-command, Lieutenant Samuels. Samuels was one of the few people in the department Angela trusted implicitly. He had been supportive from day one, even when others doubted her leadership. Now he stood in front of her desk, arms crossed, as she recounted the morning's events. Samuels frowned. "It's disappointing, but not surprising," he admitted. "We've got a long way to go, Chief. You know that." Angela nodded. "I do. But we can't afford to wait for change to happen on its own. We need to be proactive." She leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "I want a full review of our traffic stop policies, and I want mandatory training sessions for every officer, real training, not just checking boxes." Samuels raised an eyebrow. "That's going to ruffle some feathers," he said. "You're already walking a tightrope with some of the senior officers." Angela met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "Let it ruffle," she said firmly. "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make this department better." As Samuels left her office, Angela leaned back in her chair again, feeling the weight of her decisions. She knew she was making the right call, but that didn't make it any easier. Change was never easy, especially in an environment like this one. But if she didn't push for it, who would? Across the city, a different kind of conversation was taking place. Angela's encounter with the rookies had sparked whispers among the community. Word spread quickly, and soon community leaders were discussing what had happened. Some were hopeful, seeing Angela's reaction as a sign that things might finally be changing. Others were more skeptical, wary of empty promises and slow progress. At a local cafe, Marcus, a longtime community activist, was sitting with his friend Danielle, a public defender. They had both heard about the incident, and they were dissecting it over cups of coffee. "I'll give her credit," Marcus said, stirring his drink. "She handled it better than most chiefs would. But one incident isn't going to fix a system." Danielle nodded. "True, but it's a start, and we need to support people like her if we want to see real change." She paused, then added, "Have you thought about reaching out to her? Maybe working with the department on some community initiatives?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You think she'd listen?" "She seems like the kind of person who would," Danielle said. "And if she doesn't, at least you tried." Marcus considered this, a thoughtful look on his face. He wasn't sure what difference he could make, but maybe Danielle was right. Maybe this was the time to build bridges, not walls. Back at the precinct, Angela was preparing for a department-wide meeting. She had called it on short notice, and the officers were buzzing with speculation about what it would be about. Some were nervous, others indifferent, but Angela was determined to set the tone for what was to come. As she stepped into the briefing room, the conversations died down, and all eyes turned to her. She looked around the room, meeting their gazes one by one. There was a mix of curiosity, respect, and resistance in the air, but Angela didn't waver. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I called this meeting because I believe it's time for us to have an honest conversation about who we are as a department and who we want to be. This morning, I had an experience that reminded me just how far we still have to go, and I want to make something very clear. The status quo is not good enough. Not for me, not for this department, and certainly not for the community we serve." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Angela continued, her tone firm but not angry. "I know change is uncomfortable. I know it's easier to keep doing things the way they've always been done. But that's not why we're here. We're here to protect and serve, and that means holding ourselves to a higher standard. It means being better." As she spoke, Angela saw a range of reactions in the room. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She didn't expect everyone to be on board right away, but she wasn't going to back down. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We're going to have tough conversations. We're going to face challenges. But I believe in this department, and I believe in our ability to grow. It's not going to be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then one officer started clapping, and soon others joined in. Not everyone, but enough to show Angela that she wasn't alone in this fight. As she walked out of the room, Angela felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was long, but she was ready for it. Whatever it took, she was going to make sure this department became something the community could truly trust and believe in. After the meeting, Angela stayed in her office, her mind running over everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. The applause had been encouraging, but it wasn't enough to erase the resistance she had seen in some of the faces in that room. Change wasn't going to come easily, it never did. And as much as she wanted to believe in the potential of her department, Angela knew there were still undercurrents she couldn't see, attitudes and behaviors lurking beneath the surface that no policy or training could fix overnight. She was lost in thought when a knock at her door brought her back to the present. It was Samuel's. He stepped in, closing the door behind him, and his expression told Angela that something was wrong. "Chief," he started, hesitating for a moment. "We've got a situation." Angela's heart sank. What kind of situation? Samuels handed her a tablet with a video queued up. "This just started making the rounds online. It's not good." Angela took the tablet and pressed play. The footage was grainy, clearly shot on a phone, but the scene was unmistakable. It was the rookies from earlier that day, standing by her car during the stop. The audio was muffled, but Angela could hear snippets of their conversation, enough to understand how casually they had assumed she was someone to be questioned, someone who didn't belong. The video ended with Angela driving away, leaving the officers standing there, their expressions frozen in shock. It was clear the person filming hadn't known who she was, but the caption on the video made it worse. Asterisk racial profiling at its finest. When will this stop? Asterisk. Angela set the tablet down and pinched the bridge of her nose. How bad is it? Samuel sighed. Bad. It's already been shared thousands of times, and the comments, well, you can imagine. Angela didn't need to imagine. She knew exactly what people were saying, and she couldn't blame them. This wasn't just a public relations nightmare, it was a blow to the very trust she had been trying to build. I need to address this, she said, her voice firm. Right away, Samuels nodded. I figured you'd say that. But, Chief, this is going to bring out all the critics, inside the department and out. Are you ready for that? Angela met his eyes, her expression resolute. I don't have a choice. If I don't face this head-on, we lose whatever credibility we've gained, and I'm not about to let that happen. By the time Angela stepped out of her office, the precinct was buzzing. Word about the video had spread fast, and everyone seemed to be on edge. Some officers avoided her gaze, while others whispered in corners, their faces tight with worry. Angela ignored them. She walked straight to the briefing room and called for an impromptu meeting, her voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. When the room filled, Angela stood at the front, her posture tall and unyielding. She held the tablet in one hand, letting it rest against her side as she surveyed the room. I assume most of you have seen the video by now, she began, her tone calm but commanding. If you haven't, you will soon. It's out there, and it's not going away. She paused, letting her words sink in. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. This video represents everything we're trying to move away from, she continued. It's a reminder of why we need to be better, not just for ourselves, but for the community we serve. This isn't about two officers making a mistake. It's about a culture that allows those mistakes to happen in the first place. Angela set the tablet down on the table in front of her, the screen still showing the paused video. I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame, but I am here to tell you that this stops now. Not next week, not next month. Now. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. Then, from the back of the room, a voice broke the silence. And what if some of us don't agree with this new direction? Angela turned toward the voice. It was Officer Torres. His tone wasn't hostile, but it carried a challenge, and his arms were crossed over his chest. We've been doing things a certain way for years, he continued. Are you saying all of that was wrong? Angela held his gaze, her expression steady. I'm saying that if the way we've been doing things has led us to this moment, then yes, it's time to reevaluate. It's not about right or wrong, it's about growth. It's about being willing to admit that we can do better. Torres didn't respond right away, but Angela could see the wheels turning in his mind. She didn't need everyone to agree with her right now, but she needed them to hear her. After the meeting, Angela returned to her office, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. She knew this was far from over. The video had already done damage, and the conversations it had sparked, both in the precinct and in the community, would take time to address. But as she sat at her desk, Angela allowed herself a small moment of hope. Change was never easy, and it often came with resistance. But it also came with moments like this, moments where the cracks in the system were laid bare, forcing everyone to confront the truth. Angela picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in a while. When the voice on the other end answered, she smiled faintly. Marcus, it's Angela. I think it's time we had that conversation. The road ahead was uncertain, but Angela was ready for whatever came next. She had a department to lead, a community to rebuild trust with, and a fire in her heart that wouldn't be extinguished. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of the most important chapter yet. Angela sat back in her chair after her call with Marcus, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. She hadn't spoken to him in years, not since their last heated debate at a community forum, but she knew he cared deeply about the issues she was trying to tackle. If anyone could help bridge the growing divide between the department and the community, it was him. She just hoped he was willing to meet her halfway. But as Angela prepared for what she expected to be a tough, honest conversation, a knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Samuels stepped in again, his face more serious than she'd ever seen it. He closed the door behind him, and Angela could feel the tension radiating from him. "What is it now?" she asked, bracing herself. Samuels handed her a printed report, and Angela scanned it quickly. Her stomach tightened as the words registered. It wasn't about the video this time. It was something worse. "We got an anonymous tip," Samuels said, his voice low. "There's chatter about someone in the department leaking information to the media, not just about the video, other things too. Internal investigations, upcoming changes, it's all out there." Angela's eyes narrowed as she set the report down. "And you think it's someone on the inside?" Samuels nodded. "It has to be. Whoever it is, they've been careful. But this leak, it's deliberate. It's designed to make you look weak, like you don't have control of your own house." Angela felt a flicker of anger, sharp and hot. She had expected resistance, even sabotage, but this was more calculated than she'd anticipated. Someone was actively working against her, trying to undermine her leadership and derail the changes she was fighting for. "Do we have any idea who it might be?" she asked, her voice calm despite the storm brewing inside her. Samuels hesitated. "Not yet, but there's more." Angela raised an eyebrow, urging him to continue. "The community is starting to organize protests," he said. "The video was the spark, but now everything else is fueling the fire. People are angry, and they're not just blaming the officers, they're blaming you. They're saying you're complicit, that you've been too quiet for too long." Angela felt a pang of frustration. She had been doing everything she could to address the issues in her department, but perception was a powerful thing. And right now, the perception was that she wasn't doing enough. She stood up, pacing the room as she processed the information. "This isn't just about the video," she said finally. "This is about trust, or the lack of it. And whoever's behind these leaks is using that to their advantage." Samuels watched her, his expression unreadable. "What do you want to do, Chief?" Angela stopped pacing and looked at him, her eyes sharp. "We need to get ahead of this. Find out who's leaking the information and why. And I need to meet with Marcus as soon as possible. If the community is organizing, we need to be part of the conversation, not the target of it." Samuels nodded and left the room, leaving Angela alone with her thoughts. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she refused to let it break her. This wasn't just about her reputation, it was about the future of the department and the community it served. Later that evening, Angela met Marcus at a small, quiet diner on the edge of town. He was already seated when she arrived, his arms crossed and his expression guarded. Angela slid into the seat across from him, offering a small, tentative smile. "Thanks for meeting me," she said. Marcus studied her for a moment before nodding. "I wasn't sure if I should, to be honest. There's a lot of anger out there right now, Angela. People feel like they've been let down over and over again." Angela nodded, her expression serious. "I know, and they have every right to be angry. But I'm not here to defend the past. I'm here to fix it, and I can't do that without the community's trust." Marcus leaned back in his seat, considering her words. "Trust has to be earned," he said finally. "You can't just ask for it. You have to prove you deserve it." "I know," Angela said, "and that's why I need your help. I want to work with the community, not against it. But I can't do that if we're constantly at odds. We need to find common ground." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's a nice sentiment, Angela. But how do I know you're serious? How do I know this isn't just damage control?" Angela met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "Because I wouldn't be here if I wasn't serious. I spent my entire career fighting for change, Marcus. I didn't take this job to maintain the status quo. I took it to make a difference, but I can't do it alone." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'll work with you. But if you're serious about this, you need to show the community that you mean it. Actions, not words. Angela nodded. Agreed. Let's start by addressing the protests. We can't stop people from being angry, but we can show them that we're listening. As they talked, Angela felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. The protests were just the beginning, and whoever was leaking information was still out there, waiting to strike again. Angela didn't know what the next few days would bring, but one thing was certain: the stakes had never been higher, and she was determined to rise to the challenge, no matter what it took. The protests began as small gatherings, groups of residents holding signs and chanting outside the precinct, but they grew quickly. By the third day, the crowd stretched down the block, a visible and vocal demand for accountability. Angela stood at the window of her office, watching as more people arrived, their voices rising in unison. She had been working non-stop, meeting with community leaders and organizing town halls, but the pressure was mounting. Every step forward seemed to come with a setback, and the leak within her department still loomed over her like a dark cloud. Samuels walked into her office, his face grim. He held a folder in his hand, and Angela could tell from his expression that it wasn't good news. "Chief, we've identified the source of the leak," he said quietly, placing the folder on her desk. Angela opened it, her heart sinking as she read the report. The name inside was one she recognized: Officer Torres. The same officer who had challenged her during the meeting, questioning her new direction for the department. She felt a mix of anger and betrayal. Torres had always been vocal about his skepticism, but she hadn't expected him to go this far. "Are we sure about this?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. Samuels nodded. "The evidence is solid. He's been feeding information to a local journalist, trying to paint you as incompetent and out of touch. He even provided them with internal memos and meeting notes." Angela closed the folder, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to let this derail everything she had been working for. "Bring him in," she said finally. "I want to talk to him." When Torres entered her office, his expression was defiant. He didn't sit down, standing stiffly as he faced Angela across the desk. "You wanted to see me, Chief." Angela held up the folder, her gaze piercing. "I think you know why you're here." Torres didn't flinch. "If this is about the leaks, save your breath. I already know you found out." Angela stood, her voice calm but firm. "Why, Torres? Why would you do this? If you had concerns about my leadership, you could have come to me directly." Torres laughed bitterly. "And what would that have accomplished? You've been so busy trying to impress the community that you've forgotten about the people who actually work here. We're the ones on the front lines, and you're making changes without considering how they affect us." Angela's jaw tightened. This isn't about making things easier for the department. It's about doing what's right. And if you can't see that, maybe you're in the wrong profession. Torres shook his head. "You don't get it. These people out there," he said, gesturing toward the window, "they'll never trust us. No matter what you do, it won't be enough." Angela stepped closer, her voice low but intense. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. If you think undermining me is the answer, you're not just wrong, you're dangerous. You've jeopardized everything we're trying to build here." Before Torres could respond, Samuels entered the room. "Chief, you need to see this," he said urgently, holding out his phone. Angela took the phone and watched a live stream from the protests outside. The crowd was larger than ever, and at the center of it, Marcus stood on a makeshift stage, addressing the people with a microphone in hand. His words were powerful, calling for justice and accountability, but as Angela watched, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. In the background, hidden among the protesters, a small group of people was moving with purpose. They weren't holding signs or chanting. They were carrying backpacks and looking far too coordinated for comfort. Angela's instincts kicked in, and she handed the phone back to Samuels. "Get a team out there now. Something's not right." By the time Angela arrived at the protest, chaos had already erupted. Smoke filled the air as a small explosion went off near the stage, sending people scattering in panic. Marcus was unharmed but shaken, and Angela immediately took charge, coordinating officers to secure the area and assist the injured. She spotted the group she had seen on the live stream, trying to slip away in the confusion, and she signaled for backup. The officers managed to apprehend the suspects, uncovering homemade explosives and evidence of a larger plot to escalate the protests into violence. Angela felt a chill as she realized how close they had come to disaster. This wasn't just about the video or the leaks. Someone had been trying to exploit the tension in the community for their own agenda. Back at the precinct, Angela sat with Marcus in the briefing room, both of them exhausted but relieved. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, "for acting so quickly. That could have been so much worse." Angela nodded. "We got lucky, but this isn't over. Whoever orchestrated this is still out there, and we need to find them." As the investigation unfolded, a surprising twist emerged. The mastermind behind the violent plot wasn't a member of the community or a rogue activist. It was an external group with no ties to the city, aiming to sow chaos and division for their own gain. The revelation brought a sense of clarity and a renewed determination for Angela. The challenges within her department were significant. They paled in comparison to the larger fight against those who thrived on discord. Angela stood before her officers the next morning, her voice steady and resolute. "What happened yesterday is a reminder of why we do this job. It's not just about enforcing the law, it's about protecting the people we serve, even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible. We have a lot of work to do, but I believe in this department and I believe in this community. Together, we can rebuild trust. Together, we can make things right." As the officers nodded, some more hesitantly than others, Angela felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. The days following the chaos at the protest were a blur of activity. Angela worked tirelessly, coordinating with investigators, community leaders, and her own department to ensure that everyone involved in the incident was held accountable. The arrest of the group behind the violent plot had shifted the narrative, and while tensions still simmered, there was now a shared determination to prevent such manipulation from ever happening again. Marcus played a key role in this new chapter. He and Angela spent hours in meetings, hashing out plans for increased transparency between the police and the community. They agreed on initiatives like regular town hall meetings, the creation of a citizen oversight committee, and partnerships with local organizations to address systemic issues. Angela knew these changes wouldn't erase the past, but they were a step toward a better future. For Angela, the hardest part came when she had to confront her department about Torres. The evidence against him was irrefutable, and she knew she couldn't let his actions go unpunished. At the same time, she recognized that his betrayal was a symptom of a deeper problem, a lack of trust and communication within the force itself. At a department-wide meeting, Angela addressed her officers with a mix of candor and conviction. "What Torres did was wrong," she said, her voice steady. "But it's not enough to just hold him accountable. We need to ask ourselves why he felt the need to act the way he did. If we want to move forward, we have to rebuild trust, not just with the community, but with each other." There was a long silence, and then one of the veteran officers, a man named Jenkins, spoke up. "It's not going to be easy, Chief," he said, "but I think you're right. We've got to start somewhere." Angela nodded, grateful for the support. She knew it wouldn't be unanimous. Change never was, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, she implemented new measures to improve communication and morale within the department. She also took the time to listen to her officers, understanding their concerns and finding ways to address them without compromising her principles. Meanwhile, the community began to heal. The town hall meetings were contentious at first, but they gradually became a space for honest dialogue. Angela made a point of attending every session, answering questions directly and admitting when she didn't have all the answers. Her willingness to be vulnerable earned her respect, even from those who had initially been her harshest critics. Marcus was instrumental in bridging the gap between the police and the community. His reputation as a fierce advocate for justice lent credibility to Angela's efforts, and his partnership with her sent a powerful message. Progress was possible when people worked together, even when they didn't always agree. One evening, after a particularly productive town hall, Angela and Marcus lingered outside the community center, watching as people filed out. There was a sense of cautious optimism in the air, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. "You've come a long way, Angela," Marcus said, a hint of a smile on his face. "I wasn't sure you could pull it off, but I think you might just prove me wrong." Angela laughed softly. "High praise coming from you. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still a lot of work to do." Marcus nodded. "True, but tonight feels like a win, doesn't it?" Angela looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. "Yeah," she said, "it does." In the weeks that followed, the department continued to make strides. The Citizen Oversight Committee was established, and its members included a diverse mix of voices from across the community. Angela also launched a mentorship program for new recruits, pairing them with experienced officers who embodied the values she wanted to see in the department. For Angela, the turning point came during an unexpected encounter at a local coffee shop. She was grabbing her usual order when a young woman approached her hesitantly. Angela recognized her as one of the most vocal protesters from the early days of the demonstrations. "Chief Walker," the woman said, her voice uncertain. Angela turned to her, offering a warm smile. "That's me. How can I help you?" The woman shifted nervously but then met Angela's gaze. "I just wanted to say, I didn't think I'd ever trust a cop, let alone a police chief. But you've shown me that change is possible. It's slow and it's hard, but it's real. So thank you." Angela felt a lump in her throat as she responded. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know." As the woman walked away, Angela realized that moments like these were what made the fight worthwhile. Change wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping victories. It was about earning trust one step at a time, one person at a time. The story didn't end with a perfect resolution. There were still challenges to face, still setbacks to overcome. But Angela had learned that progress wasn't about achieving perfection. It was about refusing to give up, no matter how steep the climb. Late one night, as she sat in her office going over reports, Angela glanced at a small framed photo on her desk. It was a picture of her father, taken during his days as a police officer. She thought about the lessons he had taught her about integrity, resilience, and the importance of serving others. In that moment, she felt his presence, as if he were reminding her of why she had chosen this path in the first place. Angela leaned back in her chair, letting out a deep breath. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope. And as she turned off her desk lamp and prepared to head home, she knew she wasn't alone in this journey. Together, with her department, her community, and people like Marcus by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next.